A woman named Clara Johnson, rejected by a wealthy landowner in Riverbrook because of her race, uncovers hidden historical injustices related to her family's stolen land. With courage and determination, will she be able to reclaim justice? Like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more captivating stories. Now, let's get started. Clara Johnson stepped off the train in Riverbrook with hope in her heart, her chest swelling with excitement as the promise of a new life danced in her mind. She was in her mid-30s, elegant in her black coat and white gloves, a woman who had spent months in heartfelt correspondence with a man named Thomas Richards. His letters had been full of warmth and affection, his words painting a picture of a kind, lonely widower looking for companionship. Clara had imagined this moment countless times during her long journey. She was ready to start over, away from the prejudices she had endured in the big city, where she had often felt like an outsider. She had sold everything she owned to make this trip, carrying with her nothing but hope, a trunk full of clothes, and the dream of a new beginning. But as soon as she stepped onto the platform and saw Thomas standing there waiting for her, her heart sank. His face, which had been so kind and welcoming in his letters, now showed nothing but shock and discomfort. She watched as his eyes took her in, scanning her every detail, but it was clear he had not expected what he saw. His face went pale, and for a moment it seemed like he could hardly breathe. His bouquet of flowers trembled in his hand as he stumbled for words. "This isn't going to work," he muttered under his breath, his voice almost choking on the words. Clara froze, the smile on her lips faltering as the truth of the situation hit her. She had spent 6 months writing him, sharing her thoughts, her hopes, and her dreams, yet in the blink of an eye, all of it had been shattered. He had rejected her, not for who she was, but for the color of her skin. Her heart felt heavy with humiliation, but there was a steely resolve behind her eyes. She had traveled too far, spent too much, and given up too much to turn back now. "You didn't mention that you were—" Thomas faltered again, unable to even speak the word. "That you were black," he finally finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara stood tall, her heart aching but her dignity intact. "What did you expect?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "That my skin would be different just because we wrote to each other? You never asked." Thomas, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted on his feet. Clara could feel the eyes of the station workers and the passing travelers on them, the whispers already starting to rise. She knew she was the center of unwanted attention, but she refused to be cowed by it. She had fought too long to get here, and no man, no matter how much he had promised in his letters, would have the power to diminish her worth. She stood there, composed, despite the searing humiliation burning inside her, determined to hold on to her pride, no matter how small the spark of hope had been that had led her to Riverbrook in the first place. As Clara stood there, heart aching but resolute, a deep, commanding voice broke through the tension that hung heavily in the air. "Is this how you treat someone who's traveled so far?" The voice came from a tall man who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his steps steady and sure as he approached the scene. Clara's eyes shifted toward him, and for the first time since arriving she felt a flicker of relief. This man was different. Where Thomas had shrunk back in fear and discomfort, this man exuded strength and authority. His presence seemed to fill the space around him, his posture straight and confident, with an air of quiet command that demanded respect. "What's going on here, Thomas?" the man asked again, his voice unwavering, his eyes fixed on the bewildered figure of Thomas, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. The man was dressed in simple yet expensive clothes that spoke of wealth without being ostentatious. His sun-tanned face, though weathered by years spent outdoors, carried the unmistakable marks of someone who had built his fortune with his own hands. Clara could see that he was no ordinary man, but someone of substance, someone who knew the weight of his words and the power of his actions. He turned to her, his gaze softening, and with a small, respectful nod he continued, Miss, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Samuel Hayes. I own the ranch just outside town, and I believe you could use a place to stay. Clara, taken aback by the unexpected offer, hesitated. The thought of staying with a complete stranger was unnerving, especially after the rejection she had just endured. But something in Samuel's calm demeanor put her at ease. He spoke with a genuine kindness that she hadn't encountered in Riverbrook so far, and it was hard to ignore the sincerity in his voice. Still, doubt lingered. Was this man offering his help out of a sense of charity, or was there something else at play? Thomas, now looking visibly uncomfortable, stepped forward to protest. "Samuel, you can't be serious. What will the town say? This isn't proper," he stammered, his voice faltering. But Samuel wasn't deterred. He simply looked at Thomas and then back at Clara, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "The town can say whatever it likes. The fact is, you've made a mistake, Thomas," he said coolly. "I know what kind of man you are, but I also know what kind of man I am. And I believe Miss Johnson deserves better than this public humiliation. I won't stand by and watch it happen." Clara, stunned by the boldness of Samuel's words, felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never encountered anyone like him, someone who was willing to challenge the status quo without fear of consequence. Without waiting for further words from Thomas, Samuel turned to her and extended his hand. "Please come with me. You are welcome at my home until you decide your next course of action." Clara, still unsure of her own emotions, found herself drawn to the offer. It was not just the kindness in Samuel's voice, nor the power he commanded in this moment. It was the unwavering belief that he genuinely wanted to help, that he saw her as a person, not just a woman marked by the color of her skin. And in that moment, a small flicker of hope began to stir inside her once again. She had come to Riverbrook for a fresh start, and perhaps, just perhaps, Samuel Hayes could help her find that path. Clara took a deep breath, her pride and her fears clashing within her, and with a final glance at Thomas, who stood there defeated and speechless, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I will come with you." As Clara followed Samuel Hayes through the gates of his estate, a sense of awe began to wash over her. The ranch, nestled just beyond the town's borders, was a world apart from the small, oppressive town she had just left. The gravel road crunched underfoot as they walked toward the large, stately home, its Victorian architecture standing proudly against the backdrop of rolling hills. Clara had seen many grand homes in her life, but none quite like this. It wasn't just the size that took her breath away. It was the quiet elegance, the understated luxury that spoke of a life well lived and carefully curated. The air here felt different, cleaner, and as she inhaled deeply, she could almost taste the freedom that seemed to hang in the air. "I hope you don't mind the simplicity," Samuel said, noticing her gaze. "We've lived simply here. The land is what's important." Clara glanced up at him, still processing everything. Samuel Hayes wasn't like the other men she had met in Riverbrook. He was not only a man of wealth, but of principle. There was no pretense about him. His clothes were modest, his demeanor respectful, yet there was a quiet authority in every movement he made. Clara couldn't help but feel that he was the kind of man who commanded respect without ever needing to ask for it. As they reached the house, Samuel turned to her and said, "This will be your room, Miss Johnson." The guest room was beautiful, with an antique wooden bed covered in soft linens and a view that overlooked the sprawling pastures. Clara stepped inside and marveled at the stillness of the room. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of her arrival in Riverbrook. She felt her shoulders relax for the first time since she had stepped off the train. "I'll leave you to rest for now," Samuel said, his voice gentle. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Clara nodded, grateful for the respite. As Samuel closed the door behind him, she sank onto the edge of the bed, letting out a long, steady breath. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about this place, about Samuel, that made her feel safe. She knew she was a stranger here, but for the first time it didn't feel like she was unwanted. She had arrived in Riverbrook expecting rejection, but now, in the warmth of Samuel's home, she felt a glimmer of hope. The days ahead were uncertain, and Clara didn't know what the future would hold. But in this moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find peace here. After all, she had come looking for a new beginning, and Samuel Hayes had given her the chance to find it. For the first time in a long while, Clara closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift into a restful sleep, the promise of something better hanging in the air. A week passed at Samuel Hayes's estate, and Clara's life began to settle into a strange, quiet rhythm. The initial shock of her arrival had worn off, and she found herself spending her days in the expansive library of the mansion, reading, reflecting, and slowly starting to reclaim her sense of self. Samuel, ever the gracious host, allowed her the space she needed, never intruding but always offering support when needed. Their conversations, though few, were meaningful, filled with insights into his own life and beliefs. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke it was with purpose, and Clara found herself listening intently, intrigued by his quiet wisdom. Yet despite the comfort she was beginning to find, there was still an underlying tension, an unspoken truth that hung in the air. Clara had come to Riverbrook to escape the prejudices that had defined much of her life, but she was keenly aware that the small town's narrow worldview had not simply disappeared. It was during one of these quiet days that the tension finally reached its breaking point. Thomas Richards, who had been a constant nagging presence in the back of her mind since her arrival, appeared once again at the gates of Samuel's estate. Clara had been walking through the garden when she saw him standing at the edge of the property, looking uncertain and uncomfortable. His face, once full of false kindness, now looked strained, as though the weight of his earlier actions had finally caught up with him. Samuel, who had been standing nearby, noticed him as well. His expression remained neutral, though there was a slight tightening of his jaw. "It's him, isn't it?" Clara asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Samuel nodded. "It's him," he confirmed. "I'm not sure what he expects, but you should be prepared for whatever he says." Clara drew in a breath, bracing herself. She had tried to move on, to build a new life, but she knew that Thomas's presence would inevitably come with a reckoning. She wasn't ready to face him, but she knew she had no choice. Slowly, she made her way toward him, her footsteps purposeful, her gaze never wavering. As she approached, Thomas stood a little straighter, but there was an undeniable nervousness in his posture. "Clara," he began, his voice hesitant, "I came to check on you, to make sure you're all right." The words felt empty to her, a hollow attempt to undo the damage he had caused. Clara stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze cool but unwavering. "I'm fine," she said simply. "Your concern is a little late, don't you think?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Samuel, who stood a few paces behind Clara, watching the interaction with quiet intensity. "I didn't mean for things to happen the way they did," Thomas stammered. "You judged me before you even knew me," Clara interrupted, her voice firm. "You saw my skin and decided that was all that mattered." Thomas opened his mouth to speak but faltered, unable to find the right words. Clara didn't wait for him to finish. "You don't get to make excuses, Thomas," she continued, her tone cold. "You don't get to decide who I am based on my appearance." A long silence stretched between them. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the garden. Thomas's face flushed with embarrassment, but Clara could see the flicker of something else in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or the sting of pride wounded. He opened his mouth to speak again, but this time it was Samuel who spoke first, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've already said enough, Thomas," Samuel said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "Clara doesn't need your apologies, and neither does this town." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her at Samuel's words. He had always been a man of quiet strength, but in this moment, his power and authority were unmistakable. Thomas looked between the two of them, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. "I don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Why are you helping her?" Samuel met his gaze without hesitation. "Because Clara is worth helping," he said simply. "And because, unlike you, I see her for who she truly is." The words hung in the air between them, and with a final glance at Clara, Thomas turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. Clara stood there, watching him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt no satisfaction in his departure, no sense of victory. Instead, there was a quiet peace, a sense that for once she had stood her ground and had not been moved by the judgment of others. She looked up at Samuel, who gave her a small, approving nod. "You did well," he said softly. Clara met his gaze, feeling a mixture of gratitude and admiration for the man who had given her the space to reclaim herself. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Samuel smiled, a rare softness in his expression. "You would have been fine," he said simply. "You're stronger than you think, Clara, and you've just begun to realize it." As they stood there, the weight of the past still hanging over them, Clara felt a new sense of clarity. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Clara spent the following days in the Maxwell Estates library, poring over books, historical records, and legal documents. The library was an expansive room, filled with shelves upon shelves of books that seemed to go on forever, and Clara felt both small and large within its walls. She was small in the sense that she was a woman alone in a foreign town, a stranger trying to build a new life. But she felt large in the way the knowledge before her opened up a world of possibilities. The estate, with all its beauty and grandeur, seemed so far removed from the hurt she had endured in Riverbrook. But here, in the quiet solitude of Samuel's library, Clara found not only solace, but purpose. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets to her, secrets about the town, its history, and the land that so many had claimed without question. While Samuel was out managing his ranch, Clara had begun to delve deeper into the local history of Riverbrook. She'd already been introduced to its founding families, including the Richards family, whose business dealings with Clara's great-grandfather were part of the foundation of the town's wealth. Clara knew the town had a complicated history, but what she didn't realize was how deeply tied that history was to her own family's past. Her great-grandfather, Joseph Freeman, had been a freedman after the Civil War, someone who had spent his life working hard, earning respect, and fighting for his rights. What Clara uncovered, hidden deep within dusty, yellowed pages, was a truth that could shake Riverbrook to its core. The land on which the town was built had not been rightfully theirs. In the late 1800s, when the town was being established, her grandfather had owned a large tract of land that had been illegally seized by the town's founding families. The documents, which had been concealed in the town's archives, were now sitting in Clara's hands. As she flipped through the fragile papers, Clara's hands shook not with fear, but with the recognition that this was the key to understanding everything that had been wronged. Joseph Freeman had been forced to flee the town after threats and attempts on his life, leaving behind not just his property, but a legacy that was stolen. The Richards family, along with others, had divided the land, building their wealth on the backs of people like Clara's grandfather. Clara sat there, in the quiet of the library, feeling the weight of the truth settle on her chest. The injustice her family had endured wasn't just something from the past, it was something that affected the present. Riverbrook, a town she had hoped would offer her a fresh start, had been built on the very foundations of exploitation and deceit. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Clara knew what she had to do. She couldn't remain silent about this injustice, not when she had the power to make things right. Clara didn't know yet what kind of battle she was about to face, but she understood one thing. Riverbrook had a debt to pay, and it was time for her to make them listen. She carefully put the documents back in the briefcase she had brought with her, feeling a quiet resolve take hold of her. The truth, no matter how painful, would come to light, and this time, it would not be hidden again. Clara was ready to confront the past, ready to stand up for her grandfather, and ready to fight for a future that no one could take from her again. It was time to return to Riverbrook and face what she had been avoiding. It was time to make them all see that the past had a way of coming back, not for revenge, but for justice. The day Clara had been both dreading and anticipating arrived sooner than she expected. Armed with the legal documents and historical records she had uncovered, she knew that the time had come to confront the leaders of Riverbrook. Samuel had been supportive, offering quiet words of encouragement, but even he could not mask the tension that crackled in the air. The town meeting was being held at the old town hall, a building that had stood for generations, its stone walls a silent witness to the secrets that had been hidden within Riverbrook. Clara had always known that the town's history was steeped in traditions of old, but now, as she prepared to face its leaders, she saw just how deep those traditions went, and how much they were willing to protect what had been stolen. Clara entered the town hall with Samuel by her side. His presence, calm and reassuring, gave her strength as she walked into the room. It was filled with the town's founding families, local merchants, and influential figures, all gathered in their Sunday best, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. The murmurs stopped when Clara and Samuel entered, and all eyes turned toward her. The room grew heavy with silence, and Clara felt every gaze on her, each one more piercing than the last. At the far end of the room, Thomas Richards stood, his face a mask of thinly veiled discomfort. He had been the first to judge her, the first to dismiss her because of her skin. But now, in the quiet of the hall, he seemed smaller, diminished somehow. Clara could see the fear in his eyes, though he tried to mask it with a forced smile. He was the first to speak, his voice shaky as he cleared his throat. "Clara," he began, though his words were stiff, "I hope we can settle this issue amicably." Clara knew better than to believe in the sincerity of his words. "Settle this issue?" she repeated, her voice steady but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "There is nothing to settle, Thomas. The truth is simple. This town was built on stolen land. My great-grandfather, Joseph Freeman, was forced to flee for his life after his land was seized by your family and the others here." The words hung in the air like an explosion, and for a moment the room was completely still. Clara could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone in the room, but it was Thomas's face that gave it all away. He blanched, his hand gripping the edge of the table in front of him, as if he were trying to steady himself. "You're lying," he sputtered, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed him. Clara opened the briefcase she had brought, pulling out the fragile documents, the original deed signed by the governor in 1866, the account of the land that was stolen, and the records that showed how her grandfather had been forced to flee after he was targeted for lynching. She laid them on the table, watching as the murmurs of disbelief spread through the room. "This is not a lie," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "These are the records, the documents that prove your ancestors were part of the land theft that built this town's wealth." She turned to face the rest of the room, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the men and women who had long held power in Riverbrook. "You may not want to hear this, but it's the truth, and the time has come for you to face it." There was a long pause before Samuel spoke, his voice steady and strong, cutting through the tension in the room. "Clara is right. This is no longer about the past. It's about righting a wrong that has been buried for too long. This town owes her grandfather, and it owes her." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke, as the full weight of Clara's words settled over the room. The leaders of Riverbrook were confronted with the undeniable truth, and there was no escaping it. Finally, a voice spoke, trembling with uncertainty. It was Reverend Miller, an older man who had been a quiet member of the community for years. "We've heard the rumors," he said slowly, "but I never thought it would come to this." The Reverend looked down at the table, clearly struggling with the truth. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara stood tall, her heart pounding but her resolve unshakable. "We start by acknowledging the truth. We start by creating a foundation to right the wrongs done to my family and to others who've suffered under the weight of these injustices." She looked at each person in the room, her gaze unwavering. "The land was never yours to take. It's time we fix that." The room was still, but Clara knew this was only the beginning. Whatever happened next, she had already made her stand, and the truth was now impossible to ignore. Months had passed since that fateful town hall meeting, and Riverbrook had slowly begun to change. The foundation that Clara had proposed, the Freeman Foundation, was now a reality, funded by the wealth that had once been built on her family's stolen land. Clara, despite the small but powerful victory she had achieved, knew that this was only the beginning. The town, however, had already begun to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. People who had once turned their backs on her, who had been quick to dismiss her, were now turning up at the Foundation's events, offering apologies, pledging support, and asking for forgiveness. The work was far from over, but the transformation was undeniable. The Freeman Foundation had funded scholarships for local children who had never before had the opportunity to attend school beyond the elementary level, and affordable housing projects were beginning to take root, providing families who had been displaced by Riverbrook's growth with a chance at a stable future. As the town began to heal, Clara found herself stepping into a role she had never envisioned for herself. She was no longer the woman who had arrived in Riverbrook looking for a fresh start. She was now a leader, a voice for the voiceless, and a beacon of hope for those who had been overlooked for too long. She had become a part of the very fabric of the town, and as she walked through the streets, she could feel the change in the air. It was subtle, yet powerful. People no longer whispered as she passed by. Instead, they greeted her with smiles, with respect, and with gratitude. But perhaps the greatest change had been within Clara herself. She had started this journey broken, humiliated, and unsure of where her place in the world was. But now, she stood tall, her heart full of pride, knowing that the town she had once thought she would never belong to had, in its own way, accepted her. Riverbrook had changed, and so had Clara. She had come seeking justice, but in the process, she had found something much deeper, a sense of belonging, and the understanding that true change begins not with vengeance, but with the courage to stand up for what is right.